It's very good to be together. We start with a heavy heart. We are just hearing now about another terrible shooting down in Texas involving youngsters, and so I just mentioned that to acknowledge that it's happened again. Welcome, though. Welcome to all of you. We very much appreciate you're joining us. One ID Columbus is a local coalition of 11 organizations, and we are pressing for a municipal ID program for the city of Columbus. We would like that to be a city-led program, but we're also exploring the idea of having a local nonprofit run program instead. We got into this really in 2015. The Bread Organization and Central Ohio Workers Center joined forces to start the coalition after hearing stories from hundreds of our members about obstacles they faced in obtaining ID. The Columbus City Council commissioned a feasibility study on the viability of a municipal ID program for Columbus in 2019. The results were favorable, yet the pandemic pushed the proposal to the back burner. We've been working to engage a new advocate on Columbus City Council since 2019. And our purpose today really is to listen and learn and ask questions. And the motto of One ID Columbus from the very beginning, you'll see in my shirt here, is ID equals opportunity. And so we see this really as an opportunity to learn from folks who are involved in programs around the country. Thanks again for being here. And I'll turn things over to Charlene Brown.
Thank you, Ed. You know, when a person finds themselves without any ID and unable to prove who they are, it can lead to some really serious trouble. To illustrate this point, we have a couple of video testimonies. First, we'll hear from Lamar Peoples, former director of outreach and partnerships at Star House, which is a drop-in center for homeless youth here in Columbus. And then we'll hear from Pastor John Cox of Carl Road Christian Church.
And we are a 24/7 drop-in center that helps homeless youth experiencing homelessness right here in Central Ohio, ages 14 through 24. I'll start by sharing a little bit of my personal experience and why there's a need for a municipal ID. It's more important, apparent now more than ever. And I grew up right here in Columbus, Ohio, and moved a lot within the city due to the inability of my family to sometimes pay rent, substandard living conditions, and crime. Every time my family would move, we would find ourselves having to get a new ID card. And because of low wages, increases in the cost of living, and mental health concerns, we had to consistently choose between an ID or food, an ID or the rent, an ID or my grandmother's medicine. And the list just continued to grow. Beyond that, in my current work, I encounter individuals from multiple different states, cities, and countries. These individuals have aged out of foster care. They are victims of human trafficking and have moved to Columbus because of the myriad of resources that we have here, much like Star House and others. Most, due to their circumstances, don't have the number of documents needed to get a state ID. Imagine not being able to get a job, obtain a home, or be able to have the dignity to show proper identification. The municipal ID will help people like Lamar. It'll help the youth who moves here from Georgia because they believe in the promise of our city. It will message to all far and wide that Columbus is the city where one can have a place to feel wanted and supported. Bread. Thank you.
And now the video from Pastor John Cox of Carl Road Christian Church.
My name is Reverend John Cox, and I'm pastor of Carl Road Christian Church here in Columbus, Ohio. I'm very glad to be talking to you today and telling you my story. I have been a resident of Ohio my entire life. I was born in Cincinnati. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to England and serve as a pastor over there. Now, while we were there, we still voted in the elections. We had a passport, obviously, and we had a driver's license over here and a residence in Michigan. When we came back to the States, we settled in Columbus, and we were looking forward to getting our life settled again. Well, we went to the bank that the church does banking with the treasurer with a check that he had signed to open up the account. The clerk behind the counter said we couldn't open an account. We asked why, and he said, well, because of the Patriot Act. He said, do you have a rental agreement? Now, we were living with friends at the time. I said, no, because we don't have a bank account. He said, well, do you have a utility bill? And I said, no, because we don't have a bank account. And he said, well, there's nothing that we can do to help you. Now, my story turned out okay, but it doesn't always work out that way for everybody. And if Columbus had a municipal One ID program, maybe it would work out better for other people too.
And so their stories illustrate how much of a need there is. We thank both Pastor Cox and Lamar Peoples for sharing their stories. Now that you have heard the need, we want to tell you about a key solution that is being used by communities around the country called a municipal ID card. These are local photo ID cards issued by local governments. Some places call theirs community ID cards because instead they're issued by nonprofit organizations, but they're still recognized as valid by local governments. For more background, we're going to turn things over to Dr. Alexander Heckman, Chair of the Department of Public Administration and founder of the Public Administration Programs at Franklin University here in Columbus. He and Dr. Chanel Jones were the researchers who put together a feasibility study, which was commissioned by the Columbus City Council. Their report was finalized in 2019, but professionals tell us that not only is the information still valid, but the need for ID has become even more dire because of the pandemic. Dr. Heckman, it's all yours. All right, apparently we do not have Dr. Heckman connected. Let us try going on and introduce our panelists. So if you have questions now, you can email them to oneidcolumbus@gmail.com. You'll be able to use that going forward. Let's talk to our panelists. And then we're going to do the question and answer portion of the program. Our panelists come to us from a number of different cities around the country. From Chicago, we have Danish Murtaza and Fred Sau. From New York, we have Albert Gamera. Then Damaris Feliciano is with us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we have Margaret Cox from Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, you probably have lots of questions for these representatives, and if you do, you can send your question as a private chat message to Clarissa Epps. She's right here in the room with me, and she will make sure that I see your questions. Now, since there are variations from city to city, please be sure to indicate which city your question is about. For example, if your question is specific to Chicago, please mention Chicago as part of your message or question. And if we don't get to your question tonight, we will have a record of the questions and we'll follow up with you by email. So panelists, I'm going to call on each one of you to introduce yourself, share a little bit about the positive aspects of your community's program, and then have you answer a specific question about your particular program. You will have 3 minutes each to respond. So Danish Murtaza in Chicago. In your introduction, could you also share with us about the importance of having Chicago's ID connected to transit?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to everyone for having me, for having us and having this program together, it is really incredibly important to have these conversations and have this sharing of the minds, essentially. So the city of Chicago started their municipal ID program starting from 2017. And as a quick background, our municipal ID program, called the City Key, has printed to date 63,486 IDs. It is a 4-in-1 card. So firstly, it is a municipal ID. It is a Chicago Public Library card. It is a prescription discount card. And of course, it is a public transit card. And to also mention, we have a number of different business partnerships as well, where folks can get discounts when they visit those locations and show off their City Key ID. So for example, just to mention a few, you can get tickets for the Chicago Sky for 20% off, or you could get a free day at the Field Museum, or 20% off Navy Pier. These are some attractions here in Chicago. And so in talking about public transit specifically, the way our process was set up was that with our public transit system, the Chicago Transit Authority, which is the CTA, which is our buses and trains within the city of Chicago, they use a platform called Ventra to access buses and trains. To ride the CTA, you basically tap your Ventra card, which is a hard plastic tap to pay card. And in 2017, we entered into an agreement with the CTA to purchase 150,000 blank Ventra cards. They're the same cards, with the exception that they're entirely blank, except with a stripe at the bottom of the card providing some basic Ventra information. And we use these cards to print our city keys. And once printed, the city key then can be used for public transit immediately. No activation required because it's already compatible with the system. All you need to do is load the fare. And I have some demonstration IDs here. So here is the blank card, if you all can see. This is a blank Ventra card. So entirely blank. It's already compatible with the system and has a stripe at the bottom for the Ventra information. And this is what we feed into the printer. And then this is the final product right here. So this is all the information of the city key, and you can see there's that Ventra information right there at the bottom. So that is
Just
how,
a few seconds left, Danish.
Oh, no worries. So that's how we're compatible with the CTA system. And really, it's important because it promotes greater public transit usage and promotes greater accessibility overall.
All right,
Thank
Danish,
you.
thank you so much. Appreciate you showing the card too. Fred Sau, you are also involved with Chicago's ID program. As you introduce yourself, can you also talk about those other uses for Chicago's ID card besides transit and why that's important?
Okay, thank you, Charlene. Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon, I guess early evening. My name is Fred Sau. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. And I was very much involved in the development of the City Key program in the years running up to the the launch of the program in 2017, and then early in the implementation of that program. And I still have my City Key. I believe I was number 125 among the City Keys that were issued back then. One of the major things that was important in developing the City Key was making sure that it would be useful and interesting, not just to those people who have a particular need for the ID, but for other Chicago residents as well. The last thing we wanted was for this ID to be kind of a scarlet letter or a giveaway that the bearer of it is, say, an immigrant or an individual returning to the community after prior incarceration. So we wanted to make sure that this was a card that would appeal to and be important to the broader community overall. So, obviously the transit use that Danish mentioned was really important. Also, the library card function was also really important. And I want to note here that our previous mayor, Mayor Emanuel, particularly emphasized this point when he was talking about the city key. In that he wanted to make sure that the city key was useful for accessing city services and city departments and city agencies, and one of the largest city agencies here in Chicago is the public library. So we all wanted to make sure that that this ID was useful for borrowing items from the public library, gaining access to library resources, and playing a key role in the education of the city. The prescription drug aspect as well was particularly important insofar as we wanted to make sure that it was useful for a number of purposes. The city was rolling out its prescription program, and so why not combine these two programs and make the city key useful for the prescription drug aspect as well. And then quite a number of the other things that Danish mentioned, access to museums, discounts at local businesses and stores, access to sporting events, all of these were as well very important in the development of this program. We actually looked at New York as a really good model for that. I know Albert will be representing IDNYC.
Yes, he will. And we're going to have to stop you there, Fred. And in fact, we're going to pause the introductions for a moment because we do have Dr. Heckman now. Again, he is the chair of the Department of Public Administration, founder of the Public Administration programs at Franklin University in Columbus, and was one of the researchers who put together the feasibility study that was commissioned by Columbus City Council. Dr. Heckman?
Yes. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you for having me here tonight. I was asked to sort of summarize the key findings from our study. To give a little background, we tried to review everything available out there about city IDs that we could find. So looking into reaching out to existing programs, and also looking at journal articles, newspaper articles, anything that we could find was out there. And as a number of people know on this call, there's been some other studies and research done. And then when we talk about for in-depth examination, we went and visited and spoke with a number of programs, particularly we went and looked at Detroit's program, Washington County's program, which is also in Michigan near Detroit, and New York City's program. So those we actually, and in addition to doing some interviews and getting documentation, we went out and visited those programs to get an on-the-ground look at how they do things in some detail. When we talk about the key findings from our research, the first thing we found was that it's really important to have a clear purpose for why you're doing the ID program. If you try and accomplish everything, if you will, it's often going to be very difficult to successfully achieve the purpose of the program. Most of the programs are started for a reason to try and help a particular, what we would call vulnerable population, get access to ID. In many of the cases, that population is, trying to help folks who are foreign born and non-residents, and then they may have not be able to get a state ID, for example, because they don't have a social security number or documentation of citizenship or other reasons. Other populations that programs are started to serve are folks who may be getting re-entering the community after being incarcerated. That's sort of Washtenaw County has focused on trying to make sure that everybody released from the county jail has identification, for example. And then there are other vulnerable populations, like people who may be not have housing, and certain other folks, whether they're older or minority populations that for various reasons don't have the documentation needed to get a state or other identification card. And so, as again, I think probably most people on this call know, right? Folks who don't have that identification have various challenges, whether that's opening a bank account or getting a job or doing other basics in the community. And so helping them get an identification card can be really important. And then also if there are interactions with law enforcement, to have identification can be really beneficial for them, to make those interactions as smooth as they can possibly go. And also that can make, we found this very commonly, that oftentimes the police were sort of skeptical of these community or city ID programs. And that's largely, I think, because they don't know what they are, and they're not confident in the security that will be behind these cards, that it'll be like, a library card or something that anyone can get without much difficulty. And actually, if they're brought into the process and involved, then they learn what it really is. And if you do the security part of it right, then they get confidence, and oftentimes they become some of the biggest advocates, because many of them do see the benefit, once it's in place, that rather than having someone who doesn't have an ID, who you then have to decide, am I gonna take this person maybe to downtown, so to speak, or because I don't know who they are and try and spend a lot of time figuring that out, or am I just going to let people go? If this helps reduce how much that decision has to be made, which is why often one of the vulnerable populations that's the focus of the city ID starting is foreign-born residents. So when I talk about getting back to that point of having a goal that you're starting with, sometimes people think, oh, well, we want everybody to get this card. We'd like the whole city, every resident. And that's certainly an important goal, to want to have residents besides the vulnerable populations that you're trying to help get it, because then you're reducing the stigma that goes along with getting a card, and that the idea that, oh, this card's for everyone, and we, and other residents outside of the vulnerable population do get the card. That's good, right? That's an important part of the program, but you still have to be clear on the primary target population, because in looking, in our research, on average, about 1 to 3%, I should say, of the entire residential population is probably going to end up getting the card. Even New York City, which has done the best, I don't think has exceeded, at least when we looked at it, which was a couple of years ago, was about 15% of the total population. So that's amazing. Like, and if you know anything about New York City's card, which is just incredible, they have invested a huge amount of resources, I think far beyond what most any other program has invested, at least on an overall basis. It might be maybe not on a per capita basis, but so on the other hand, communities that have focused on a particular population, like say foreign born residents, like they can sometimes get a third of that population to get a card. Or if you talk about focusing on folks who are re-entering from jail in Washtenaw County, almost everybody who gets released from their jail gets a Washtenaw County ID card. So by that measure of our goal, our primary goal, not our only goal, but the primary purpose why they're doing that is to help this population, they've been totally successful. But if you measured their success by what percent of the county's total population got the card, well, then you might go, that's not so great. So you do have to think about that and be clear. And that's also really important because if you know the focus of who the primary population or populations you're trying to serve, then you're going to focus a large part of your resources, your time and effort on trying to get the word out and getting connected with those people in those populations to get the card. Whereas if you're just scattershot, really focused on the whole community in a broad way, then it's much more difficult to really get the populations that are maybe most vulnerable that you're really trying to serve. And then, like I said, it's probably going to look like you're not being that successful because you haven't gotten a large percent of the total resident population. So that said, another important thing that we learned was that you do want to have the card to have a lot of benefits, right? Beyond beyond just identification. And so when we looked at it, a couple of communities have their card linked to the transit system so that they can use their ID card also to use the transit in the community. When we spoke with CODA, they said that was a definite possibility, if such a card were created in Columbus, that they could work with them so that it would be able to be used for the system. Of course, that's again an example of understanding the purpose. If having transit access or using it for transit is an important purpose for the particular populations that you're focused on, then you would want to make sure when you're designing the card in the planning stages to work with CODA, right, to make sure that was going to work. If you wait till after the fact, right, then it could be more challenging, if not maybe even not possible, at least in the short to intermediate term. Most of the communities, it's linked to the, at least in most of the large, I should say, I'm talking sort of comparing to the larger communities and the major programs that we looked at, have it linked to, it can be used for the library in the area. And again, when we talked to the library, they said, oh yeah, that would be something we could totally do. Again, if there was collaboration between the community ID program or city ID program and the library. Almost all the programs are providing benefits or discounts at museums, cultural institutions, businesses. So that's a very common thing. And that's one of the main features that can make the card most appealing to any resident in the community is if there's a benefit of getting a discount at the museum or COSI or the zoo or going to some stores. Although that is one of the most challenging and parts, and I think one of the parts in our research that does take, you have to keep doing that in terms of both finding these partners who want to be involved with the card and have the card holders get some benefit from it, because you do have to do a certain amount of maintaining, like marketing and branding and getting the word out and making sure the benefits stay relevant or current to card holders. And if you think about Columbus, there's a lot of different ways, or any community, I suppose, that people can get a discount to go to the zoo, or you can go to the free day at the museum. So there are often a lot of ways for people to get these kind of benefits, and the card may not necessarily be the only one. And again, particularly for the broader population, I mean, you have to treat it like, you're marketing this product that has these benefits, and that means maintaining and sustaining that and doing things on a regular basis to promote it. And for example, New Haven has the oldest program in the country. It was the first one. And when they rolled it out, it was very, exciting and new and successful, and it has been successful for a long time. But when we spoke with the person who oversaw it in recent times, it's kind of fallen out of favor. It's not getting as much support as it was from maybe political leadership and other people in the community. And they're seeing some declining, participation in people renewing their cards, because it's just not being sustained in terms of support, the marketing, getting the word out about it. So you have to put in that work over time to make sure the card stays relevant and the benefits stay relevant, or you will lose, just like I think any program that one's doing, if they don't continue to market and keep it in the eye of the community, then people will kind of, forget about it or forget about the benefits they can get. And so, whether it's entertainment and sports discounts at restaurants and for food, discounts at beauty and apparel stores, all these are very common benefits that if, whether it's the city or an organization in the community was able to invest the time and effort, you can cultivate those partnerships, you can get those benefits. And it's those benefits, that make it most appealing to just your average resident. Get everybody seeing this as their community card that they want to get. And actually, one of the most interesting things I thought from New York City, because they've done the most surveying and formal evaluation for their card, is the number one reason, and I think it was something like 70% of people who got the card, one of the top reasons they said was because it made me feel like I'm a part of the community and the city, and it gave me some identification with them. And so I think a big part of that reason is that New York City has done a phenomenal job of marketing their card, getting the word out that this is for everybody in the community, and this is a way to show pride that you're a New Yorker. And also, I think they do this other thing in a little bit more of a, not a direct way, but letting people know by getting the card, you are helping support maybe the primary vulnerable populations that they're trying to serve. And I know how good their marketing is because I have a thermos from the city ID program and a stress ball, and I got a whole bunch of branded things that are really nice that they've done to roll out their program.
So Dr. Heckman, it sounds like there are lots of interesting benefits far beyond the identification part. We're running short on time here, so I'm going to have to
Can I wrap up
things
here
up
just
with you there? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can I just say a couple more things and then
Yes.
wrap up? I appreciate it. I'm sorry I ran over. The last thing I want to say, or no, I'm sorry, not last thing, just three more things. So one of the other main benefits that people are often expecting to get is for it to be a primary ID for financial institutions. And that has actually proved to be very challenging. In our research, it looked like that might not be feasible for the city ID program in Columbus, or would at least take a lot of lobbying with probably the state government, Ohio. The other final things I wanted to mention was that, like I said, the police often are skeptical, so you really have to make sure you involve them and make sure you're using good privacy policies and security policies so they'll support it, so they'll accept the card, and they can become some of the biggest advocates. You also want to have strong privacy policies for the people who are applying and not maintain their records and things any longer than you have to, so that you can avoid having people come and say do records requests or subpoenas to get their information. And the last thing I want to say is, if you do roll out a card, you have to be prepared. And that first 6 months is going to be the big surge of activity and enrollment in pretty much every city we spoke with. They were not prepared for that. And then it, affected the rollout, it delayed it, or there were all kinds of problems that people faced. And that at least is kind of embarrassing, if not preventing people from then being willing to participate. But then the other challenge is, after that surge, right, the activity slows down and you don't need as many people. So that's something to be prepared for as well. So I thank you for allowing me to share this information and the research that we did. And like I said, I don't think there's a more comprehensive study than ours out there about what's going on in city ID programs in the country. Thank you.
All right,
Sorry if I ran over
Dr.
a little bit.
Alexander Heckman, thank you so much. That has been very informative. And it's interesting and kind of fortunate for us that you held up New York City as one of your primary examples, because we're going to go back to our panelists. And I'd like Mr. Albert Gamera from New York to introduce his program and also talk a little bit about New York's experience regarding that issue Dr. Heckman just brought up about retention of documents, since applicants do have to furnish some sort of proof of their identity. Mr. Gamera?
All right, good evening, everyone. So here in New York City, our program is built on a foundation of integrity. We need to make sure that we are verifying identity appropriately, so that our partnerships with our local police department include something that creates accessibility. We want to have a foundation where this is an accessible card, but one that everyone has confidence in for the future. It's not just a one-time thing. It's not just an initial thing. And so it's about the long-term growth and accessibility that the card will provide. As you've indicated, we've been very successful here in New York City. We have over 1.4 million card holders. We have added a number of benefits: prescription card, library card. We have a lot of public and private partnerships. But at the end of the day, what a Muni ID is to me, as someone working in the IDNYC program, is local government working for the people, local government finding ways to increase that sense of community. And community, and it's something moving forward, is not necessarily just within your city. These programs, we operate within our city. We know the needs of our city better than anyone else. And it's about finding out what are the specific benefits that the members of our community want, both whether they are the targeted populations of these cards or not. It's about finding ways to improve that sense of community, finding ways of improving accessibility, finding ways of, increasing the positive nature of these communities, the relationships with the police department, the relationships with social services institutions. And that is what IDNYC started at in the beginning and continues to work towards. And it's something that, as municipal ID programs, we should always look at. We're not state DMVs. IDs are not new. It's a way of creating an ID that is unique. People are very proud to have an IDNYC card. Like we have, this is our original version of the IDNYC card. And then we renewed it and made a different type recently. They have security features. They, give them a sense, of belonging here. And it's something that I know with our partner municipal ID programs, it's the same thing. I have no doubt that in Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, Cincinnati, Providence, that they're very proud to have that ID card because it's something that says, this is where I'm from, and I'm very proud to be from this location. On a personal level, being able to have those memberships with cultural institutions that I never went to before as a New Yorker. And I think it's something that we take for granted at times. We live in our cities and we don't take advantage of those things that are there. And by having this available, I think it opens doors to a lot of folks that are within our community to take advantage of that. And it's also the need to be thinking towards the future. How do we market these cards to individuals that necessarily don't need them, but if they hear what they have to offer, they want it? And I think that is something that, as you move forward as a program, is making sure you communicate, get the message out and make it a message of, at the end of the day, like I said, community and accessibility. And I think that'll be the foundation of your success.
Charlene, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
This mute button is making me crazy. You would think I've never used one before. Thank you again, Albert Gamera from New York City. Good to hear more details about your program. Now I'm going to call on Damaris Feliciano from Philadelphia. And in your introduction, we'd like to have you share how local police can verify that a card is valid and belongs to the person who is using it.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Damaris Feliciano. I am from the Managing Director's Office and for the City of Philadelphia. I am the Director of Community Relations and Strategic Initiatives for the Community Services Department. And I oversee the PHL City ID. So one of the benefits that our Philadelphia PHL City ID has is that the police officers can verify the identity of the individual. Because we have we are restricted on the information that we can maintain. They will not see the picture of the individual, but if they were to go onto a website, validate.getphlcityid.com, they will be able to compare the unique number the individual has on their ID. They will not get their address, but they will get other information, the documents that they did give to the PHL City ID individual when we verified their information and we processed their card when they originally got the ID. So that's a way that our Philadelphia Police Department can really identify the individual the individual did get the card from our offices, and that the documents they did give were identified as real and not false through our Gemalto and Nexus Lexis systems.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Ms. Feliciano. And let's see, we now have with us, joining from Providence, Rhode Island, Jose Giusti. And Mr. Giusti, as you introduce yourself and your program, could you tell us a little bit about how the ID program has been beneficial to Providence Police as they interact with residents?
Yes, how are you, Charlene, and everybody? Thank you for having me today. So basically, this definitely helps. I mean, a lot of you guys have definitely touched on, well, first of all, my name's Jose, with the City of Providence. I'm the Deputy License Administrator for Board of Licenses, but also the Vital Records Department, downtown Providence in Rhode Island. And on specifically the ID PVD was introduced to us in 2018. And when it was introduced, I mean, we've processed a lot of IDs. Everybody has touched, basically, we've kind of mirrored what other people are doing, but this is definitely beneficial for the police department when it comes to identifying individuals. So this has definitely helped. We've helped a lot of people try and get this ID from homeless, people experiencing homelessness to, school students, obviously with a parent or guardian. So this definitely helps the police department. and we've had a lot of feedback from them. Just basically just identifying folks. It's very difficult when they don't have an ID or can't get an ID. And like some people have mentioned in the past, just having that sense of belongingness also is, crucial. It's for them. It's very important for them. People have stressed to me personally in the office of how much they're in dire need of this ID. And sometimes they don't have the supporting documents that they need. So I think that is very important because we don't know what everybody's dealing with, but they probably experienced a time or two where, they've either been pulled over by the police or something like that, and they have nothing to kind of prove their identity. So from the feedback that we've had from the police department, it's definitely been beneficial. And on that. Was there anything else, Charlene? I'm sorry, I might have missed something. I was just relocating from a noisy area I was in.
No, you're fine, Jose. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about how residents are helped when they can provide this particular type of ID to the police. How does that help the resident? How does that help the police officer?
When they had the ID.
Mm-hmm.
When they had the ID, I think it's.
Your audio is leaving.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hang on a second. Can you hear me now?
Okay, we're still not hearing you. All right, maybe someone will ask that question in the chat. So we'll come back to you, Jose. Thank you. And now we have Margaret Fox from Cincinnati, and we understand your program is run by a nonprofit and is considered valid by the city of Cincinnati. So in your introduction, could you please talk about the process that was involved in getting the city government to pass a resolution recognizing the card, including having the police recognize it and other municipalities recognize it as well?
Okay, in 4 minutes. So we started our process really in 2011 with a declaration of principles to guide Ohio's immigration discussion. We modeled that after the Utah Compact. Some of you may remember that. Then in 2013, a few months into 2013, the city of Dayton in Ohio did a Dayton Welcome program. And that was another model to welcome immigrants, to the city. So in a few months after Dayton welcomed immigrants, Cincinnati did a Cincinnati Welcomes resolution that was passed by city council. So we're leading up to something more significant. In 2014, our new mayor, Mayor Cranley, formed an immigration reform task force. And so a variety of community organizations were asked to participate, including MARC, the organization I represent. And the purpose of our organization is to improve public policy and in the process, civic discourse. There was a lot of civic discourse over immigration reform at the time and still is. Then the task force, after a year and a half of study, and they studied municipal IDs, they studied legislation, all kinds of things. They made recommendations, each of the work groups. 2 of the recommendations were shared by all the work groups, and there were immigrants in those work groups. The City of Cincinnati Police had representatives, Cincinnati Interfaith Workers, a couple of the unions. I mean, it was really robust. One of the 2 recommendations was a photo ID. The mayor went to the Archbishop of Cincinnati and asked if he would pull together, a process. First Catholic Charities of Southwest Ohio, they went to the Archbishop, and the Archdiocese is a member of MARC. And the Archbishop said he thought it was better for an interfaith organization to spearhead the initiative. So we took that on and we set up a memorandum of understanding with Catholic Charities of Southwest Ohio, because they are the federal government's designee for refugees and immigrants. They are the first stop. And so we, the mayor had a press conference that essentially Mark put together. And we wanted the ID to be for immigrants, but we also wanted it to be broader. We wanted it to include all kinds of vulnerable populations or just the general public. And we had a press conference that went extremely well. And we had a variety of folks speak to the need, like the gentleman did at the beginning of this program, to the bread conference. And we had, yeah.
Ms. Fox, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to wrap you up. If you could finish your thought. We are running over time and.
Okay, so the mayor did not want a municipal ID card because he felt, and the city solicitor felt, that they would be open to a lawsuit. So we went the city ordinance route. They didn't want that. So then we went to the resolution approved by city council, and because we are a city manager form of government, we had the city manager craft an executive order to all the city departments that they would honor the Mark ID card as a primary ID card in all municipal services. From there, we spread to Hamilton County that has 13 more jurisdictions that are under it in terms of law enforcement. And in 2019, before the pandemic, the city of Covington, which is also in Kentucky, is also a city manager form of government. And they liked the idea. The police chief was young and on board, and their commissioners passed the same type of resolution, although they called it an ordinance. So anybody in Covington or beyond who has a Mark ID card, those city services will be able to take advantage of. So,
all right, Margaret Fox in Cincinnati, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And that brings us to, we thank all of our panelists for your input, and that brings us to the question and answer portion of our program. Questions that are coming in from the audience. The first one is going to be for Chicago and Providence. So let's start with Donish and then have Jose answer this one. How many IDs do each of your cities distribute every year, and what is the cost of running these programs?
So by year, I don't have that breakdown in front of me, but for in total, we have printed again 63,486 IDs, and the program has been running since early 2018. And in terms of the cost, the startup cost for the program was approximately $1 million, give or take. And then since then, it's been approximately, give or take, $1 million to run the program on a yearly basis. And that covers items like our own staff, our city clerk office staff of 4, our third-party vendor contracts, our licensing, our materials, and our transportation.
All right, thank you. And Jose?
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Lean close to your microphone. We're still having trouble hearing you.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So roughly, we started the program just about the same as Chicago in 2018, June of 2018. And just that year alone, we processed about 1,000 IDs.
You're going in and out, Jose.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me clear? A little bit? No?
No. Okay, maybe you can type it into the chat for us since we're having audio issues here. Our next question is for New York. Has your city ID participation increased or decreased during the pandemic?
I think we were all affected by the pandemic. And it's part of, there was less reason to take advantage of the benefits. We had a time period there where our enrollment centers around the city were closed, so you couldn't even go and get an ID card. And so now that we're moving, hopefully, in a post-pandemic kind of new world and getting back to somewhat the new normal, we are hopeful that things will continue to move in that way. We recently launched a day of action to kind of get the word out about the program and about the renewal prospects of the program, highlighting a number of new benefit partners. So it's just like any, program. It's a work in progress, and we were all affected, but I think we will all bounce back post-pandemic.
I would also like to ask, have any of you had any issues with forgeries or falsification in issuing these IDs? Any problems along that line? Damaris, were you about to offer an answer?
I was just shaking my head. We haven't. Philadelphia hasn't as of yet. We launched on April 2019, and I just would like to ask to Albert's question. And so we launched on 2019, and then came the pandemic on 2020. Our launch was amazing. It was successful, and then we just had a one day to another shutdown for approximately 4 months. So that did halt all our operations. We resumed our operations on September 2020. And from there, it was a very slow start, but I am very happy to say that we are past our original goal. From 2019, we are surpassing our numbers, and we are really back into the swing of things. We're in high demand for our mobile sites, as well as our walk-in given IDs at our city hall in Philadelphia. And we are thankful because one of the success is that our youth are coming in to get IDs so they can get summer work ready. Programs, they can enter into those, they can get bank accounts. So we have seen like a peak on our youth from 13 to 17 come in to get IDs. And the other thing that was very successful for us was that one of the things that our mayor established was, his big thing was, we're not labeling anyone, this is inclusive. And because we are doing this, we as staff of the city of Philadelphia are going to model. So what he did was that our city ID are now PHL city staff IDs. So and he was the first one to actually take his picture and model what he wanted to do. So we are happy to say that now we have 3,613 individuals, city staff, who are now carrying PHL IDs as city IDs, employment IDs, and it's part of the HR onboarding process for the city of Philadelphia.
All right, that sounds excellent. Thank you. And Dr. Heckman, I see you have your hand up. Did you have a comment or question?
Well, I was going to answer the question that was asked, if that's all right.
Yes,
in terms of what we found, because this is a very common issue. People who are maybe skeptical or resistant are like, well, what about the security? And we found, again, that programs almost always end up working with law enforcement. And so law enforcement and the expertise those groups get helps make sure there's a good, sufficient level of security and good practices followed issuing ID. But also in talking to some of those folks, like, if you really think about it, the reason people would create a fake ID or fake documentation is for some usually financial gain. And there's really nothing to be gained by copying a city ID. So there's really not a reason for people to do that. It really does just primarily benefit the people who really need it. So I think that's often a concern that's raised that just never really bears out. There's not cases of this going on.
All right, thank you, Dr. Heckman. And now we do have a question specifically for you. Are successful city ID programs tied to city funding, or are there some successful programs that are funded by non-municipal entities?
There certainly are some programs that are purely or largely run by nonprofits. I believe South Bend, Indiana's, theirs is run by a nonprofit and was created. And I think similar to what was said earlier, like for Cincinnati, the city has adopted, some resolutions that it will be accepted by city agencies. So again, that helps ensure some of the legitimacy and benefits. And Washtenaw County, actually, they have a really nice partnership relationship with a nonprofit and the county government. In some ways, I think that's kind of a model, because you have both the support and some of the resources of the county, but you also have a nonprofit that really knows and works with some of the populations that they're really trying to benefit from having the card. And so that's a really nice example of sort of a partnership. But certainly, when you have a city government, unless you have a really a nonprofit that has a lot of resources and a lot of budget, that can be a challenge. Whereas when you bring in a city government, they tend to have some more resources to put behind it for sure.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Heckman. Our next question is for New York and Chicago. And that question is, what would you have done differently? Fred, Sal, we haven't heard from you in a minute. Would you like to weigh in on this one for Chicago?
Oh my.
Go ahead, Fred. Go
Sounds like
ahead.
a no.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. There was some initial resistance. I remember pitching the idea of a municipal ID to what was then the incoming Emanuel administration back in 2011. And we ran into a lot of hesitation, in large parts because certain officials in the city did not want a program that would specifically identify immigrants and particularly create a database of individuals, most of whom were likely to be immigrants in need of identification. So, again, I think we were able to resolve that issue in a number of different ways. I think, I wanted to push back, I tried to push back hard by making sure that the card was, had a lot of the features that Denise and I mentioned that would appeal to the broader population of the city. And then we also, put in place the procedures to protect the information that of individuals who were applying. So we were able to get around that initial resistance, but it did take a while. And so if that was, if I were to name something that's, I wish we'd done differently, I wish we'd better address the concerns by, the people in the city who at the time who raised the concerns. I think part of the reason we were able to overcome this is that the person who was raising the objection most vocally left the city, and so we were able to move on with his replacement, and then who ultimately became one of the leading advocates for the municipal ID for the city key, both within the city, both within the mayor's office, and then ultimately when she transitioned to the city clerk's office, she essentially took over the program from there.
Okay,
Sorry,
good lesson to be learned. Same question for Albert Gamera in New York. What would you have done differently? And if you could tell us in 30 seconds, that would be excellent.
Honestly, I think learning and partnering with the other cities would have been something I would have done from the ground level, like as we built, because look at the innovation with Philadelphia with the workers and having employee ID. Look at the innovation in Chicago with utilizing it for transportation. I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And it's something that, like I said, at a local level, it's really that teamwork and that amazing, will help us better serve our constituents. So I think that would be one part that I would have looked at differently. Otherwise, I think we did an exceptional job of what all the information was available at the time.
All right, thank you. And because he's having audio problems, Jose Giusti in Providence offered his comment. Let's see if I can get it back. His comment regarding the number of IDs issued in the chat. The city of Providence has issued approximately 1,000 IDs just in 2018. The city of Providence is contracted with a company called Valid, which is the software that they utilize to process, that is, the applications for IDs. However, as far as the specifics on the cost, he doesn't feel he can publicly disclose that. So thank you, Jose, for offering that insight. Our next question is for New York and Cincinnati, and that is, how do you determine someone's identity without paperwork, or do you? Let's hear from Margaret Fox in Cincinnati first.
People always have paperwork. It just may be not what the government wants to see initially. So what we require is one photo document. So it can be a passport, it can be a license, driver's license, a matricula that's even 3 months to 6 months expired. Then they have to also show proof of their residence, because our ID has the photo, the residence, the birth date, the same information that the police ask when they stop someone, and that's very intentional. So I always say even the undocumented have documents.
Okay, and just very quickly, for those who don't know what a matricula is, what is that?
That is a driver's license that is prominent in Central and South America, Mexico.
Thank you.
Many times the embassies come to the US and to specific cities to grant those matriculas for the purpose of ID. So it's good to have a relationship between whomever does the refugee and immigrant processing in your city and the consulate of those countries.
All right, and Fred, you had something to say on that, I believe? No?
Just to touch on that, I think that's kind of a messaging issue that is utilized. I don't know of any Muni ID program that does not require documents. And a lot of us are in alignment with the documentation we require. A lot of us have a lot of intensive integrity measures to make sure that, security is a vital component of these programs. And I think like I said, from my research, and there's a number of programs out there, but that is not something, like in New York, our documentation is available on our website. It runs through the process in terms of 3 points of identity, 1 point of residency. We have back-end integrity measures. We have anti-fraud measures in place. So it's something that, we do, just because your documentation is not necessarily what folks may envision or think about, there's always documentation. We have partnerships with embassies. We have partnerships with institutions to verify. The thing here is about increasing the level of accessibility and looking for innovative ways to verify someone that is not what has prevented folks in the past. And it's not just undocumented. It's individuals that, long-term homeless, individuals, the elderly, folks that, don't have financial means to get ID. And it's something that we look for ways on trying to work with them. We work, like I said, all our documentation and, as we move forward, it's verified, it's approved by our local police department to make sure that it's acceptable as we move forward. So I think it's something that we should clarify, is that documentation is always needed in order to get these Muni ID cards.
And then you limit how much of that documentation is retained by your agency?
We spoke to 2 civil rights attorneys that are very prominent in Ohio and in our region. And we do not keep data. We keep one sheet of paper, and on that sheet of paper is that individual, what documents that individual submitted, and the signature of the person that processed those documents. And
And
that was on the
Dr.
advice of 2 attorneys. So, yeah.
Just to
Okay,
piggyback
thank
on
you.
just to
Dr.
piggyback
Heckman,
on-
your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just had a couple of responses to the 2 questions, and I want to agree with the folks from Cincinnati, New York, that, and I want to credit the Sam Centellas of the South Bend. There, he was with Amistad or La Casa de Amistad. They are the nonprofit that runs their program. He said undocumented is a misnomer. Many people have lots of documents and documentation about who they are. They just don't have the specific documents that a state ID agency often wants. So it's often than not that people are lacking documents, although sometimes that's the case. And in our research, the biggest challenge is often if you're trying to help people who aren't housed, that it can be difficult to establish their residency. And so then some folks like in Washington, they've been willing to allow social workers, for example, to confirm that this person is not housed and is regularly at a shelter or something to try. And now some agencies, I'd say probably most, aren't willing to do that. They do want to have some more concrete way to confirm the residency. And I also, someone asked about the biggest thing. The number one thing we heard time and time and again about what they would do differently was they would be better prepared for the rollout. So many of these programs were hit so hard at the beginning and they weren't ready for it. You really have to ramp up your resources in the first 3 to 6 months if you want to have a successful rollout.
Yeah. To that point, we didn't think we would have nearly the number of folks, the first ID registration. They wanted the ID so bad that they camped out at the on the grounds of the public high school, all 600 of them. And the next morning we were overwhelmed, but we received everyone, and it was really quite something. It was very moving. And after that, we had a few more ID drives and kept the numbers kept up. And what we also were not prepared for, Dr. Heckman, is the election of a new president in 2017. ICE in particular became much more aggressive. And the way we dealt with that is we met on private property that also included a parking lot. That was something that actually had more of an impact than the pandemic did.
All right, thank you, Ms. Fox. We're going to have to
You're
wrap up
welcome.
there. We only have a couple minutes left. Appreciate all of your input. I'm going to call on Damaris Feliciano, who has patiently had her hand up, for your comment. And if there's time for you to also answer, how did you get support from surrounding communities? How did you get their buy-in?
Thank you. First, I just want to touch bases on and agree with my counterparts. Yes, you have to be prepared. We thought we were prepared, and from April 2019 to about January, we received we distributed 11,228 IDs. Our goal was for the 2019, from 2019 to 2020 was to be at 10,000. We surpassed our goal. Individuals were camping out 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. We did not expect that. The lines were around City Hall. And if you've been to Philadelphia City Hall, you know how big it is. Even though we're actually one of the largest cities, but it is pretty big. So we thought we were prepared, but that was surprising and exciting. So it was very surprising and exciting that our IDs were such big demands. And we don't keep any documentations. That was one of the biggest things and goals that we wanted. And that was one of the things that we really went back and forth. What documents we're going to keep? No, we can't keep any documents. What are we going to have? And decide on what information we're going to have on our IDs. So we do not retain any information. We verify the documents through our machineries and programs, and then we return and make sure everyone takes their documents with them when they leave with their ID. Our process for the municipal ID, PHL City ID, was community-led. One of the biggest things we had our mayor, he was city council at first, Mayor Kenny, and then he became our mayor. He was one of our biggest champions. Then when he became mayor, then we had 2 council persons that were really championing the program along with our mayor. So that helped us in huge ways. And then the process was community-led. We organized an advisory board made up of community leaders, advocates, and residents from different parts of the city, and they assisted us in all aspects of the programming, what restrictions, what is the programming for, who should we serve, and they were also our marketing and word of mouth to the community. So they helped us really launch our programming. And then we'll meet up with them every 6 months to really talk about what is our success and what can we improve. And we really based our decisions on them as well as the law department. But it was really community led. And I think that really helped us a lot to launch the program and be such a success in the community.
Okay, and I see a lot of heads nodding in agreement with that approach. And we just had the one additional comment from Jose Giusti that they also do not retain the documents. They verify everything, and then that's that. So I think that is all the time we have. Is that right, Clarissa? We are out of time for our Q&A. Again, if we did not get to your question this evening, we do have a record of the questions and we'll plan to follow up with you by email. You can also email any additional questions that you might have to oneidcolumbus@gmail.com. It's there on your screen. And right now I'm going to turn things over to Mark Fluharty of the Central Ohio Labor Council for some closing thoughts before we adjourn. Mark? You're muted, Mark.
Yes, that might help. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and we especially want to thank the panelists for sharing your ID efforts. I've really have learned a lot tonight. You're probably curious about next steps. Well, you heard tonight what makes a community's ID program successful. We want to work with the members of Columbus City Council to convene a group of stakeholders. The purpose of this convening would be to start thinking about what elements are needed to set up a Columbus ID program and what documents would be accepted. After that, we would want to see council work through a process of setting up an ID program that would include securing a vendor to produce the ID cards or have the cards produced by the city, working with One ID Columbus on draft legislation and getting that legislation passed, and developing a marketing strategy so that people know how they can obtain the ID card and what benefits are associated with it. Now, what can you do? You can contact Council President Hardin's office and Council President Pro Tem Brown's office and urge them to lead council to get this done. We'll email out their contact information and a sample script that you can use. Again, thank you all for your attendance. Charlene, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for being here. Hope you have learned some new things and have a better perspective, a better idea of what One ID Columbus could be and what the models are that could be followed. Thank you and good night.